My name is Tukling Winwu, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at REDSET, at the Research Center for the History of Transformation that organized this event. And it is my great honor to have such great speakers. And I just want to make one announcement when it comes to kind of, house rules. So we're going to proceed as follows. We're going to have short interventions on a couple of questions that I posed to our panelists, and then I'm going to open the floor to Q&A. And just like one last thing, I just want to say that although it's me sitting here on the stage, I think that this idea of this roundtable kind of stemmed from the collective effort of the Migration Reading Group, that is a kind of unofficial interdisciplinary group based at the REDSET. And I think that without these great members and discussions, we wouldn't even have this roundtable today. So thank you to my co-conveners. And on my left, you're right, it's really a great honor to have Natalia Gebert, who is a cultural studies graduate and a translator by profession, but also most importantly for us today, she's a co-founder of the very important Warsaw-based informal initiative Open House, Dom Otwarty, that is now a foundation. Since 2015, she has been socially active on behalf of refugees by spreading knowledge about migration. So Natalia's foundation is quite unique in the sense that it has been helping migrants already since 2015, and now obviously with the war in Ukraine. And in 2018, Natalia Gebert received the award of the capital city of Warsaw for her social activity. Natalia, great to have you here. And then in the middle, we have Professor Yanis Panayotidis, who is a scientific director at REDSET, and you probably know him by now. And from 2014 until 2020, Yanis Panayotidis was a junior professor for migration and integration of Germans from Russia at the Osnabrück University Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies in Germany. At REDSET, Yanis works on a project entitled Liberal Global Orders and Freedom of Movement. He also guides a research project on post-Soviet immigrant communities in Germany as part of their research network Ambivalenzen des Sowjetischen, funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. The research interests include migration history, transnational and comparative history, German Jewish history and Israeli history, history of Central and Eastern Europe. And he wrote 2 books that you can find on that table there next to the, at the corner. And the first book is called The Unchosen Ones, Diaspora, Nation and Migration in Israel and Germany, that came out with Indiana UP in 2019. And his most recent book monograph is called Postsowjetische Migration in Deutschland, eine Einführung. And both books you can find at the table. And I just want to say that Yanis is also a co-founder and co-convener of the Migration Reading Group at REDSET. And then, lastly but not least, we have Professor Manuela Bojadzijev, who is a professor at the Institute for European Ethnology and the Berlin Institute for Migration Research, BIM, at Humboldt University Berlin. Manuela is researching globalized and digitalized cultures. She's interested in contemporary transformations of mobility and migration, as well as of racism, an interplay with the current radical changes of work and life under conditions of digital technologies and logistification. And addressing these topics, she currently oversees 5 research projects, yes, 5, funded by the European research programs HERA, the Berlin University Alliances, as well as the Volkswagen Foundation and the German Research Foundation. Additionally, she curates together with the author Carolin Emcke at Berlin's House of World Cultures an online archives on the history and presence of forced migration to Germany. And this has been funded by the Federal Cultural Foundation and the Berlin House of the World of Cultures. And just like a comment from me, Manuela also wrote some of the most, I think, inspiring articles on the 2015 refugee crisis. So thank you so much for being here with us in Vienna. And I would just like to start with this question that has been, I think it's somehow fundamental at the same time. It's one of the simplest questions, but oftentimes the simplest questions are the hardest one to answer. So my question to all of you is, what is migration? So migration comes in many different forms, historically, as well as in our present. So how do you conceptualize migration, and why does it matter to recognize its relevance in the contemporary world within and beyond the walls of university? So like, just to kind of in a nutshell, why should we, all of us, think and talk about migration today?
Before I start, I owe you a disclaimer. Some things I'm saying might be quite obvious to you, but please keep in mind that I'm coming from a country that has been prevalently monoethnic for quite a while, at least since the end of the World War II. So yeah, some things that are quite obvious for multicultural societies are still a novelty for us. Second disclaimer I owe you is that my focus is specifically on forced migration. I work with asylum seekers, refugees. I have only a few economic migrants among my clients, or people who use Damotvartis services. This being said, someone very aptly said that migration is the new block, meaning it's a new trend that it's here and it's going to stay. It's not going anywhere. We could try to pretend it doesn't exist, of course, like my government does. But you could also try to pretend that the rain doesn't exist with more or less the same effect. I believe that the very definition of migration, being a movement from one place to another for a longer or permanent stay, has been debated so many times that it doesn't need repeating. But why should we bother thinking about it? Well, it depends how much you want to get involved in social structure of your community and social justice in your country, and all the aspects that are involved with receiving people who migrate, but also when your country is the one producing migrants, as Poland is. I mean, you probably know it better than I do, how many Polish people work in Austria or in Germany, right? The question whether we should think about migration or not is also connected to the way how we think about it. In my country, the government would like us to believe that migration is a danger, is a threat. It poses risk to the very foundation of our national identity, whatever that is. Unfortunately, this is not the only government in Europe or all over the world that thinks that way. And that means that very often migration and migration management becomes tantamount to securitization. Meaning we look at migration only as something that has to be prevented, and if not, very tightly controlled. So, of course, it must happen on our rules. We set the rules. We say who can come, who cannot, and how, if they must, on one hand. On the other hand, however, once people reach our country, at least that's the way the Polish government and many Polish people do look at migration, is, okay, as long as they don't make a noise, they might as well stay. Which is, of course, not what being a community member is about. When we say migration, we think about this academic concept, right? For me, it's talking about people I know, I work with every day. So perhaps my perspective is different, but the way I see it, thinking about migration is thinking about your neighbors, about your coworkers, and maybe family members. So that's a pretty good reason to keep thinking about it. Thank you.
I will engage with the academic concept, actually being an academic and all. And I could sort of position myself as a true heir to the Osnabrück School of Migration History, which sort of kicked off modern migration history in historiography in Germany to some extent in the late 80s, early 90s. And there was a quite well-known professor in the German-speaking scene, Klaus Bade, who wrote a sentence that's quoted very often: migration is part of the conditio humana. It is like birth and death. It's like, like rain and sunshine, whatever. He has this very fundamental statement. It gets quoted a lot. I actually think it's not true. It's or it's at least confusing in the sense that migration, like, I think what Bart is talking about is mobility, really. And I mean, we had this discussion on earlier days on mobility and migration and how to relate to each other. Migration, the way I understand it, and not just me, I mean, it kind of comes in two forms. It is, on the one hand, a technical term, I think. It is a way, and I mean, you refer to that as well. It is a way to talk about movement in space, moving from A to B, over a longer stretch of time or permanently. Usually there's a temporal component in addition to the spatial component. And quite often in standard definitions nowadays, it's about crossing a border. So this hasn't always been the case. There's, for instance, at least famous to migration scholars, Ravenstein's laws of migration from the 1880s, which were actually developed on the model of internal migrations in England. So these definitions also change, or the borders that get crossed can be political borders, but some scholars say, well, they can also be cultural borders, linguistic borders, so it depends. So there's this technical term, but there's also, migration is also a particular way of framing mobility. And that has a lot to do with the way, with what Natalia said about how migration is turned into a problem, how it is framed in political terms. And the fact that these two dimensions coexist, that has consequences for us as scholars, especially as scholars who engage with the public. So I use migration in a neutral technical way of movement, but some people understand it differently. So Lynn mentioned my book on post-Soviet migration, which is a technical term to capture different migration phenomena, different groups from the former Soviet Union, including ethnic German Spätaussiedler, as they're called, resettlers or repatriates, and Jewish quota refugees and some others. So basically different groups with different legal statuses. And I've had this discussion many a time with representatives of these ethnic German resettlers who were like, no, we're not migrants. They refuse to be called migrants because they understand quite correctly, actually, that when people say migrant in German, they mean foreigner. According to the old German taxonomy, there's Germans and there's foreigners, Ausländer. They say, well, we are Germans, so we cannot be Ausländer, hence we cannot be migrants. And so they resist this labeling. And in general, it's like migration and migrants is a label, and these processes of labeling are actually very interesting. So political attempts to declare certain phenomena migration, or sort of unlabel them and say, no, this is not migration. This is repatriation. This is homecoming. Those are not migrants. Those are refugees, or the other way around. Those are not refugees. Those are migrants. And it always has a political function, a legitimizing or delegitimizing function. And at the end of the day, to answer your second question, why should we bother? I think it's especially this political dimension that makes it relevant to talk about migration as a social fact, definitely, but also as a social construct.
Same. Problem? Hi. So, Lynn, thank you so much for inviting me to this, and hello from me. This is surely a very timely event. We are confronted with the highest numbers of refugees worldwide, more than 100 million. And in this region, we've seen a huge number of refugees coming from the war in Ukraine, which we'll be hearing more about in the next couple of minutes. I would like to simply say that I agree with the two of you, but maybe give it a little twist, because I would actually, like to foreground something that you said, and this is that migration is something that has been historically produced, right? So it means that instead of speaking of a generative idea of human mobility, we need to understand what this historical phenomena of migration actually is, right? And if we want to push it even further, we could ask, can we imagine a world without migration? And what would that be, right? I mean, that would be an interesting point to raise. I would say that it is, and agree again with you, that it is a modern phenomenon, multifarious, complex one, and it is very difficult in history to distinguish forced migration with any sort of voluntary migration. And this is something that is then expressed, of course, as well by the reaction of those who are being called migrants, are being called refugees. I could tell you parallel things about people who would come as exiles, come for reasons of war to another country, and they would refuse to think of themselves as refugee because they know about the stigmatic parts that come along with it, being called a refugee, a migrant, asylum seeker, a guest worker, an illegal, an undocumented, a Geflüchteter, etc., etc. So we give these different phenomena throughout history also very different names, and they are contradictory. So it often doesn't make much sense to try to ascribe a lot of rationality to them, unless you want to understand and research what Yannis has just been pointing out, and this is how they are being constructed, you know, through legal and political means. And I think if we want to understand what migration is, we need to take into account three phenomena. Two, mainly one has always been highlighted, and this is the political one. You know, with the with the emergence of the national state, of course, we begin to see the arrival of migration of the category of the migrant, a nation state who tries to define who's part of it and who isn't, tries to define citizenship that comes with inclusion and exclusion. Of course, historically, transformative, in a transformative way, you know. And so it's not always the same people who are excluded. But there used to be always exclusion. And with the nation states always also comes imperial force, right? The nation states are also part of a, particularly in Europe, part of a colonial endeavor, which is also really important to produce other subjects of this national state or this state, which is called differently again, but then when it begins to move to the center, it becomes a migrant. So this is one part. But I think there's a second part that I'd like to take into account, and this is, of course, the force of capital, right? So the necessity that there needs to be cheap labor supply. You know, this was one of the main motives of bringing in migrants, of people searching for a better life, etc. And of course, there's these exclusionary moments that the state creates, and there is this integrative moments that capital wishes, and there's a tension between the two. And this tension is then a conflict that Yannis has already pointed out to. When we want to understand migration, we need to look at the conflicts that come up with the phenomenon of migration. And interestingly, for the history and for the historiography of migration, when it happened at all, it usually didn't take into account one particular dimension, and this was the migrant themselves. The migrants really come into research and into the understanding of what migration is really very late. And there's even a work now that has been done, an ethnography on the border of the European migration regime, looking into EU agencies who are basically constructing the border. And what is interesting, and the finding of this study, which was a 10-year ethnography, is that the European border doesn't care about migration. It really tautologically only cares about itself. Border regime is about the border, not about the migrants. So then we arrive at the last point, which I will make very, very quick. And this is that from our perspective, researching migration for the last, let's say, 20 years, what we tried to do was to take migration as an epistemic way into understanding society. So just as you said, migration is about us in the very same time as it is about the people that we always say are marginalized, put not in the center, a particular group, etc. But what we actually learn when we look at the conflicts that occur around migration, we learn about the conflicts of our own societies.
Doesn't work yet. So thank you so much for this very rich answers. And I really like the idea that they come from different angles of involvement with migration from different regions. Maybe we can come back to some of the issues that have been raised in the Q&As. And I'd like to move with my second question. That makes it's a bit of a more presentist question, if you wish. So the ongoing war against, Russian war against Ukraine, and before this, the war in Syria, once again remains us in Europe, right? That migration in the form of mass displacement and demographic shift is an essential component of radical social transformation that comes with crisis and conflict. So the question is, what is the relationship between migration and social transformation? So is migration more of an effect or more of a driver of transformation? So what are your thoughts on that based on your, hands-on experience as activists, but also as scholars working on migration?
Why it has to be either an effect or a driver? It's both. Of course, migration is not the only factor in social transformation. There are others. But if you want an example, we recently had a social transformation in Afghanistan, right? This produced migration. This migration, in turn, produced a social transformation, for example, in Poland, where suddenly the number of Afghani people rose up significantly. But also a social transformation in the sense that many of those fleeing Taliban regime in Afghanistan weren't among the lucky, good, quote unquote, refugees that the Polish government evacuated before Kabul fell, and had to track their way through Central Asia until they reached Polish-Belarusian border, where they are summarily pushed back without being granted access to asylum procedure. To tell you a story, one of my clients, now in a detention center in Poland, was a policeman, a Hazara policeman serving in Ghazni province, the same province where Polish forces were. He actually worked with Polish soldiers. He knew a few words in Polish. So when he first time managed to cross the border between Belarus and Poland, he figured out, hey, who would understand me better than fellow policemen, right? So he walked up to the first police person he met, and he said, "Dzień dobry," so good morning, and told his story. And what the police did, they called the border guards, and the border guards pushed him back. Because he wasn't among those lucky who were evacuated by the Polish government. So he is automatically a bad, quote unquote, refugee. And those pushbacks that are going on at the Belarusian border caused yet another social transformation, namely led to a creation of something that eventually became a social movement of people, individual people who, against the intentions of the state, against the border guards, go daily into the forest to save human lives. And the whole support system behind them. So people who prepare things that need to be taken into the forest, people who give us medical training, translators on call, and so on, and so on, and so on. So if we look at migration and people who migrate as a part of our social tissue, then those two are intertwined. I mean, migration is both a reason and a cause for social transformation. At least that's the way I see it from my, very down the ground practical point of view.
So may I just add one thing just to clarify what Natalia said, that this might be obvious for those who speak Polish, but the social movement that Natalia refers to is called Grupa Granica, the border group, which is an association of Polish NGOs that basically fairly quickly in August 2021, basically went to the border zone between Poland and Belarus and immediately offered help. And now it's kind of more semi-organized, and Natalia's foundation is part of this Grupa Granica. But by now, I think that we can talk about it as a social movement, grassroots social movements, that kind of, like it's kind of grassroots self-organized movement as a reaction to the arriving refugees, asylum seekers on the Polish-Belarusian border. But just to add on one thing, Natalia's open house is unique in that sense that the foundation is that it kind of helps those at the Polish-Belarusian border, Ukrainian refugees, and those back in 2015, right? It's just a little commentary.
Well, again, sort of the grassroots perspective and the academic perspective converge in the sense that I was going to answer this question with Sinatra. You can't have one without the other. So migration and transformation go together like a horse and carriage, and but they're also mutually reinforcing. I think that's kind of an important point there. I wrote down a few examples which are more historical, not necessarily only related to international migration. I think if we talk about the Industrial Revolution, for instance, which where the transformation of production went hand in hand with massive rural urban migrations, which were migrations really in the sense that was sometimes circular, but migration is often enough circular, but in general permanent relocation of people, and in the process both the rural and the urban spaces were transformed, and a new social class came about, the urban proletariat. So this is maybe one of the most striking examples of how these processes intertwined. Or another example, which is actually, I mean, it's similar enough, but a later period of time and in different circumstances, is Soviet industrialization after 1917, or especially then during the 1920s and 30s, which was very much a forced process, a forced industrialization, which then triggered a lot of forced, but also, less forced migration. I mean, Manuela already pointed out that it's not always very clear where the line is between forced and not forced or voluntary migration, because, your voluntary decision can happen under great constraints, under great duress. But in the Soviet case, for instance, you would have examples which of, obvious, like forced migration of people just being deemed enemies of the state, whatever, kulaks. They'd be moved to camps, or they would be moved to construction sites. Like there's studies on big, like on new cities being constructed on the steppe, like Magnitogorsk, which was one famous example, where basically voluntary and and forced migrants coexisted in a sense and formed a new society. Like in Kazakhstan, whole cities were created in the process of forced migration, which then, but later on, sort of mixed up with other types of, more spontaneous, more voluntary migration. So again, there's a strong connection there. And finally, if we talk about sort of our core business here, the post-1989 migration, once again, we see the connection. So arguably, the transformation triggered migration. Although one could also say that to some extent, migration triggered transformation, because migration was actually the push. Like, I mean, that's sort of part of at least the East German story, but not only. I mean, there's also great studies on how Poland opened up during the 1980s and people started emigrating. There was greater exchange. So migration was a transformative factor already. The transformation then triggered more migration. And we've heard some of the numbers in the panel before. I mean, out-migration is massive in some places, in some countries, including Poland, though the population loss is not as great because there's also immigration, but other countries have lost a lot of people. And this again transforms societies, and not necessarily for the better. This is sort of the perspective of the emigration countries, which lose people. Certain areas get, they lose people, they get desolated, and that has political consequences, and so on and so on. So you get my point.
Oh, yes, great, thank you. Yeah, you will not be surprised that I, again, agree. but maybe I can, point out a few more things. And this is that in general, migration is an unruly element. It is always happening in a way that it can't, no one can wish for it, right? Because it is either the way, the last point that you made, that people are leaving and it's not good. People are arriving, it is not welcomed or, even rejected. And this is because migration has this structurally in between role. It is a mobile, in the first place, it is a mobile population, and this world is not designed for mobile populations, at least not in general, and at least not, and in a way that is really hierarchically stratified. So for some people, it is actually quite easy to be mobile, and for others, it isn't, up to the point where I think it is really important to include into the understanding of migration, not only the fact that people are mobile, but that some people are actually forced to stay, right? That there are stagnant populations. And then there is a gradual different category, I think a third one, and this is the population that is potentially mobile, yeah? And this is important to understand because, as we have just recently seen in Ukraine, that people have not thought of themselves being refugees in the near future, right? And I know that a lot of people, even here at least in Germany, have begun to think about the consequences of the war that may, cast their shadow much wider than the Ukraine and make even more people refugees, migrants, etc. So in some ways, it is also a human condition that there is a potential of being made mobile, right? Potentially. So, and this is something that is, I think, very important because it creates all these historical facts of, new cities, industrialization, etc., etc. But at the same time, of course, deindustrialization, the very fact that with it comes what we now have to face, huge effects of climate change, where we will probably see many more people having to flee. And of course, this migration will both be driver and effect of it, right? And so we have this, and then the question arises not only is it an effect or a driver, but also how can we make it an effect and a driver that is something that is good for us, right? And good for the people who are mobile. And this is the interestingly, I would say, the questions that no one raises. How can it be made better? Because what we are facing is a situation in which migration is constantly and continuously being made an exception. And there's always this exceptionality that comes with migration that creates the situation where there is no infrastructure, there are no laws, there's no provision for people who are mobile, etc., etc. And it always seems to come as a surprise to us, you know, oh, we have never encountered this before. Now we really have to do this. And I think that in the future, we'll probably have to think about reorganizing, and if we speak of social transformation, reorganizing our societies by the very fact that there is a constitutive part of this society that is mobile.
So these were such inspiring answers, and I already have a lot of questions to you, but I think that I really like these different scales, right? This is also what we do with Red Set, this kind of micro, mezzo, and if you want macro scales of transformation that at the same time poses the questions, what are the contours of transformation? Is transformation, you know, everything then, right? But what I did find really captivating is this idea as this kind of change on a conscious level, on a collective level, as kind of migration as a horizon of possibility that can be threatening. So that's quite interesting. So maybe we can talk about it in the Q&As. And just, I have two more questions I would like to ask our speakers. And the third one is basically it kind of is, it's connected to what we've been discussing, but it also shifts the attention a bit. So I'm really curious, like, according to you, right, as coming from, again, different angles here, what are currently the main challenges and new developments in the field of migration studies and civil society organizations? So looking at migration as a scholarly field of study, as an object of policy and law, as a lived reality, and as a political concept, and as a social movement. So what is new here? What is exciting? And in other words, you know, how would you characterize the transformations that occur in the field of migration itself? So I would also like to flip the question a bit and kind of think about where is this field going? And most importantly, the activism, you know, around migration. What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest, you know, positive, if you want, development?
If I were to list all the challenges and all the news that happen and at least in forced migration sector in Poland in the last year, we would be sitting here until morning. So looking at the different aspects of this question, as a cultural studies graduate, I've been taught that there is no one fixed view, no fixed perception. It all depends on the observer. So for absence of any refugees or asylum seekers or migrants on this panel, I would like to, for example, for a second, to observe their place and their right to speak. From as far as I can tell, based on what I hear from both from people who fled Ukraine, and that includes your white Christian Ukrainians who are, of course, entitled to all kinds of protection, and your non-white, non-Christian people fleeing the same war from the same country who are not entitled to anything. And the refugees at the Belarusian border who are not even entitled to life. I mean, this is the border where at least 20 people have died already, and that's the official figure. And unofficially, local residents are saying that wolves were pretty quiet this winter, and you can imagine why. So stepping into their collective shoes for a moment, what's new as this more and more popular perception that when you're a refugee or a migrant, you have to deserve a place in your new society. The expectations that the hosting society has of you are sometimes impossible to meet, actually. First of all, you have to have a moral certificate of sorts. So of course, no, not be a liar, not be a thief, not to mention any graver offenders. You also have to be eternally grateful, because what you are receiving is not your right. As I mean, one of our ministers in our government said that human rights are nonsense. And this pretty much clarifies the way of thinking of this government, and not only the government. The human rights are just, some sort of fancy idea. They don't really exist. They don't apply, especially to those we don't want to apply them to. So you have to be eternally graceful and to, re-earn your right to be here, or our mercy to allow you to be here. And you also, of course, have to be poor, both in the emotional and economic sense. And if you happen to deal with your trauma pretty well, your traumatic experience will be challenged. Again, to give you an example, one of my clients got her asylum claim rejected on the argument that her story is extremely coherent, and that's not possible in case of victims of sexual violence. So she probably made the whole story up, and that's why her claim is denied. Well, this list is, of course, much longer. I'm just giving the most popular, most obvious parts. And that means that all those expectations are impossible to meet, impossible to feel, no matter how much you try, which eventually leads you to one of the two choices. You die trying. I mean, you try your whole life, or you start kicking back. You start saying, hello, and it's dignity is my right. I have a right to live. I have a right to be respected. I have a right to asylum. Well, yeah, fighting back might bring you either victory or more pain, depends on the situation. But ultimately, and at this point, I'm stepping out of migrant shoes and showing my own observation. Human relations, and that's also the relation between the hosting society and the refugees or migrants, follow the same dynamics like, classical physics. Every action causes a counteraction, right? So if you denigrate someone long enough to make them fight back, the way they fight back might be not to our liking. And this will be entirely our own doing. Thank you.
Well, talking about challenges to migration scholarship, challenges and trends, developments, I guess, well, let me talk about, no, actually the challenges cause certain trends. So one question that's become increasingly relevant for migration studies nowadays is the question of reflexivity. This is sort of the latest trend in quite a bit of Europe-wide scholarship. So the question where we as migration scholars stand, what's our position in all of this, and also how we contribute to the production of the very phenomenon that we're talking about. I mean, Manuela mentioned migration is something that's being produced, and as scholars studying the phenomenon and human mobility. Yes. So now, as scholars studying the phenomenon, but thereby also calling the phenomenon migration and labeling people as migrants in one way or another, we contribute to the production of categories, and it's kind of part of the challenge, and this challenge is being increasingly taken up to question our own position and to deconstruct our own constructions to some extent. So it's like a second order observation of our own doing, which may seem, you know, a bit self-referential, but it's at the same time a very necessary enterprise. And this kind of goes together with the second challenge and the second trend, which has to do with the linkage of, well, you could sort of phrase it in classical Foucauldian terms of power and knowledge. It's the mingling up of scholarship and politics, which is in migration never very far. It has, especially since 2015, when the migration crisis or the refugee crisis, you know, made the government realize that, okay, we need knowledge. And so it started raining money. And obviously this money, I mean, it is a free country in Germany, at least. So this money did not come with official strings attached, but of course there is sort of an expectation to receive useful knowledge. And of course there are certain programs which define certain terms, certain topics, which as scholars you pick up, so that there's also like an economic incentive logic to it. And the question that we, again, have to ask ourselves constantly is, how close to politics do we want to be? How close to politics should we be? Can we be? And to what extent is it, you know, is it our duty to provide knowledge, to shape the field but, you know, for which purpose then? It's to what extent do we become actors, even activists? Those are really non-trivial questions. It's really complicated and the discussion is ongoing.
Sure. Thank you so much for your two contributions. Let me just add in migration scholarship. I think what we are seeing are two phenomena at the same time, and you will all have heard this incredible story that the UK is trying to deport people now to Rwanda, right? And also the Danish government has been thinking the same thing, and they have been starting negotiations with Rwanda themselves. So you imagine people coming here trying to find shelter, and their asylum case has been turned down, and then, you know, they come from anywhere and they, you know, find themselves in Rwanda. Whatever, you know, whatever they are or who they are, etc., and whatever, you know, the situation in Rwanda is. Okay, now this is just a symptom of what has been going on for actually decades now, about 30 years, and this is the externalization of the migration regime. And this is something that I feel we need to understand much better in its logic and operation, because it has one clear aim, and this is to keep the biggest distance possible from European and national European jurisdiction, right? You try to keep the people away from not only national rights, but also human rights as far as possible. And this is a very clear tendency. And I think this lies in a clear tension, because when we ask ourselves about the rise of authoritarian movements that we see everywhere, then we need to ask ourselves about how does our own freedom, to refer to this event as well, and our own unfreedom relate to the very fact of how we treat mobile populations. And then I think what is urgently needed, and not so much as a matter of how do we, you know, collaborate with politics or not, but as a, you know, basically a societal demand, a question of the future of how are we going to reorganize this question of migration. And I think it really needs transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary effort to understand from legal scholars, from anthropologists, from historians, from sociologists, from political science, etc., an idea and a desire to rework this. And this is, of course, because this is how our world works today, right? We are not going to stop migration. We are not going to refrain back to the nation state, although there are people who tell us this is possible and something that they wish for. So I think this tension is something that we need to look at when we look at into migration scholarship. And along with this comes the proliferation of borderscapes. So basically the border becomes anywhere. You know, you can have the border in a train station, in a train, in an airport, on an island, in the sea, even up in the sky, or you know, in the polar seas, right? So we have these conflicts that arise through migration and through the mobility of people almost anywhere now, and I think this is something that we need to understand. So the mobility of borders, the spread of conflicts that are associated with borders, and the attempt now by mostly digital technology, biometrics, etc., to try to follow the migrant where he or she isn't a migrant yet. So basically to try and understand, do preemptive politics and try to be there where people could leave and try to follow the path of these people. This is something that is the fantasy of migration management at the moment. And I think this is something that we need to understand as well. And of course, this then again creates tensions with this rise of authoritarianism, the rise of renationalization. And I think this is where migration scholarship can be very informative to take part in a dialogue amongst many disciplines, because you know, this is the part of the it's basically the dark continent of all other disciplines, as Freud would have said.
Thank you so much for that. And it's really interesting how we kind of started talking about this kind of very dialectic relationship between social relevance and social irrelevance almost, and kind of who and under what conditions, defined by whom, do we make our work relevant, right? And you guys seem to have like different approach, Janis and Manuela. And at the same time, I think that what you were saying was extremely relevant, but perhaps it's being invisibilized precisely because it happens in different scales, in different places. And, you know, it happens on a very, very micro scale, that kind of, yeah, it's not our experience, it's theirs, right? So it's kind of it seems to be a very far away experience. So, I mean, I have a last question here about freedom, right? So, I mean, okay, I don't want to sound too pessimistic because I think that I'm not a huge pessimist in the end, but I think that the link between mobility and freedom is a very uneasy one. But this is the topic of our, you know, kind of collective brainstorming for the last 4 days. And so I was just like wondering, it's a bit of a provocative question, but can we actually redeem the notion of freedom that comes with migration and mobility regime, despite this kind of very dark underbelly of undocumented migration and the kind of excess of the border regime? But it doesn't even have to be as radical as the example of, you know, being deported to Rwanda. You can even think about 5 million of Ukrainians who were forced to flee their country because of Russian aggression, right? I mean, there's nothing, if you want, I mean, it's a form of agency, but it's also a form of unfreedom that they had to leave their homes to save their lives. So, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first question that comes to my mind when we say that, when you said that freedom that comes with migration is freedom from what? Or perhaps freedom of what? I mean, yes, if you flee a war, you gain freedom from bombs dropping over your head, which is obviously a gain. But it's a trade-off. you give away, like I kind of referring to what I said before, your right to dignity, maybe your right to life. So I would be very, very careful with, equating the two. Migration brings freedom in the sense that we are free to move to a certain extent. Again, right? I'm pretty sure you all heard the term Fortress Europe, and it's not a fairy tale. I mean, what I've been telling you about the border between Poland and Belarus is unfortunately a European average, right? In Bulgaria, you have militias hunting people. And in Greece, they just turn around the boats, taking out the engines first. In Croatia, it's the police that does the beating and pushbacks. And I could continue with the examples of what's going on the external borders of the European Union in the name of our security. Or I could tell you a number of horrors that happen in Libyan detention centers, which we sponsor as European Union. All right, we pay Libya, various militias. There are two governments in Libya, in case you don't know. So we pay everyone who has any sort of power, including jihadists, to keep migrants away. Okay? So it's like Manuela said, it's okay, officially it's called externalization of our border policy, but in practice, it's trading our freedom, well, someone's life for our freedom to be free of migrants. So yeah, question of freedom is very, very tricky when it comes to migration. And technically, you also have, among various human rights, which define your freedoms, have the right to seek asylum. But then again, like any other human right, it comes with a number of restrictions, like, okay, but you have to do it in the first safe country, or you have to do it on the border crossing, not going to the border illegally. None of those are, of course, written in stone, but they become the general expectation. The problem is that those are regulations we set to fit us. Again, they don't take into account the viewpoint of the most interested, the asylum seekers and the refugees themselves.
Well, migration and freedom. I mean, we've heard in earlier talks during this week that that the freedom of movement, the freedom to move, is actually maybe the most essential freedom, the precondition to be free at all. The fundamental freedom to enable all others, but sort of on a philosophical level, that's obvious enough. But we also know that it's not that simple. That there's plenty of restrictions, especially when we talk about cross-border migration, and there is no easy solution. I mean, I think this is kind of a truism, but there isn't, because I do think that the border still matters. I'm skeptical of slogans like "no border, no nation," because that has its problem. And I think the very fact that the war in Ukraine, for instance, right now reminds us that, no nation is, it sounds good as an emancipatory project, but, it's debordering in a sense, and, negating the existence of a nation is not necessarily an emancipatory project. And the border, at the same time, can have a protective function as well, also for the people crossing it from persecution. I mean, that's sort of something we shouldn't forget either. So it's not that simple, but at the same time, I think it's also clear that the human right to leave, which is actually part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of the European Declaration of Human Rights, and of various other declarations and compacts, that everyone has the right to leave their country, means nothing if there's no corresponding right to enter somewhere. And I mean, the closest thing to a right to entry that we have is the right to asylum that Natalia mentioned. But that has its problems too, because this makes a lot of people, this forces a lot of people into this asylum system where they need to prove that they are genuine refugees, which is not that simple, in part because, you know, the sort of the evaluation is taking place in bad faith, but also because people cannot necessarily conform to the very narrow definitions of what is a genuine refugee. So it's really an absurd system that forces people into, you know, into becoming refugees when they could in fact be migrants, in the sense if there were legal ways of entry. It's also a terribly inefficient system. I mean, just the processing of hundreds of thousands of claims of cases according to these, you know, evaluating stories, do stories check out. It's an insanely inefficient procedure, and you know, this is not sustainable in the long run.
Short. I try to keep it short. And that it is, of course, I mean, as you pointed out, you've been talking about the questions of freedom and unfreedom for the last couple of days. And of course, it was, you know, the tension between equality and liberty has probably been raised many times. And it is this very figure of the migrants that are at the core of this tension. But there's a third factor, and this is this in the history of this story of democracy. And this is not only about freedom and unfreedom and equality and inequality, but it's also about solidarity, right? And then the question arises, maybe at the core of how can we get, you know, not either or equality or freedom, because we know that both do not, one doesn't exist with the other, for no one. But then the question is, how do we recreate a story based on a state based on solidarity? So, you know, to end the panel and, you know, open the discussion, let me disagree. I do have my own criticism of the slogan, no nation, no border. But I think there is a point to it that needs to be raised. And this is that the very way this nation is organized is something that needs to be criticized. And if we want to say there is, you know, the nation has created that sort of migration, then we need to also ask what kind of state that gives us equality, freedom, and solidarity can be, you know, created.
Thank you so much. I think that there's a lot of food for thought here, and I would like to open the floor for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. Yes. Yeah, Nina will come, and then there's Anna and Agata.
My name is Andrei Buzarov. I'm from Ukraine. I'm an international observer. First of all, I want to thank you, RESET, the Research Center, for the history of transformations, for such kind of very interesting conference, because I attended all 4 days of this conference and I did not ask the question. So I decided to ask finally the question, because this theme, this topic touches European Union, touches Ukraine, touches personally me. And I have a very simple question to all participants of the panel. What are the biggest peculiarity or the biggest difference of this wave of migrants, which Europe now see in comparison with the previous ones? I mean, with the waves which European witnessed during the Syria, Libya, Yugoslavia, maybe. Because I have an opportunity to travel between Ukraine and European Union, and I see how Ukrainians perceive European Union, and I see how different European countries perceive Ukraine. Because if you compare all the social support in Lithuania, in Slovakia, in Latvia, in Hungary, in Serbia even, I traveled all these countries, you will see that the social support of the internally displaced persons, because we are not actually refugees, we have a juridic definition, internally displaced persons, Ausfall für Vertriebene, yeah? if you compare, you will see that this social support is very, very different. It depends on the political, economical, social perception of the definite government in Poland, in Lithuania, in Austria. So what is the biggest difference of this way of migrants for Europe, and what are the consequences can be of this way of migrants? Thank you.
I leave the most complex answer to this question to the historian. But given, you know, I'm not sure how it is organized here in Austria. I can tell you about Germany, and there's the Massenzustromrichtlinie, which organizes this. And this is very, very different to how the movement in 2015 has been organized, or the movements in the 90s, or the movement in the 80s, only to give you the peaks of, you know, of migration movements. And of course, very different to how, you know, labor migration has been organized until 1973. So, you know, you have very different ways of this. I would say very simply, I think a lesson that could be drawn from this, and that I think would be helpful to draw, is that it seems very different to 2015 in terms of this is something that can be done from the perspective of German society. It is something that can simply be done, right? We can take in these people without making this huge fuss about it. And we can even create a substantial legal way that makes it easier for these people to arrive, right? And then, of course, I know, and I'm not naive. I've been I know migration scholarship quite well. And then, of course, we don't know how it will unfold. And of course, we don't know what will come out of it, right? So we don't know the ways this will go now. And I don't want to predict it. But I think at this point, this is the lesson we have to take in. And this is the difference. And it's a quite different, interesting difference. Because it's really different to how the refugees from former Yugoslavia have been taken in. Because a lot of them are still on this scheme, which is called in German Duldung, so a permanent renewal of their residence permission for the last 30 years. And I'm not kidding you. I mean, this is how people live in this country, right? So there's a big difference here, and I think this is a very good difference, and I think we should take it as a role model to push it even further. So.
Well, first of all, well, you were saying this, you know, now the sentiment is that can be done, but that this can be done, but actually Wir schaffen das is from 2015. So I think there were competing narratives, and it was done. And I mean, it's, I think sometimes, I mean, I always felt uneasy about sort of the glorification of Willkommenskultur, etc. But right now, sometimes I feel like it's being thrown out of the window as if 2015 and the sort of the solidarity that did exist never happened. It did happen. So there is actually a certain, even positive continuity, at least on some level. And luckily so far, but I mean, I'm a pessimist in this regard, but luckily so far, the critical, to put it mildly, the racist voices are more, they're quieter, they're more silent than they were in 2015, because Willkommenskultur always coexisted with violence and racism and xenophobia. I mean, the comparison with Yugoslavia, I think, is very instructive, because I think in terms of the way this migration, this flight unfolds, is similar enough, in the sense that those are countries close to the destinations. A lot of it is actually network migration. So people go where they know people. I mean, sort of every Yugoslav, every Bosnian had a relative somewhere in Germany or Switzerland or Sweden. And it's, well, not every Ukrainian has, but a lot of Ukrainians have family somewhere in Europe. So it is similar in this regard. And the difference is really in the treatment. So I don't know, maybe we can even be optimistic to some extent that maybe some lessons have been learned, though. As I said, it's always precarious. This is always revocable. That's sort of the problem, that at some point somebody might say, well, you know, if the war continues, maybe we'll start talking about safe zones, you know, like we're talking about safe zones in Syria, which, and then we'll say, oh, but why should Ukrainians be able to stay? They can go back to Western Ukraine. I mean, you're from Donbass, tough luck, but go somewhere else in Ukraine, you know, like, which used to be the situation for a long time for people from Donbass, right? And so, yeah, that's just a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, can I just add one little thing that is really important? Is also that you could see that the infrastructure of solidarity that was organized in 2015 is still at place. So it was very quickly reinstated now. So and you could see that, you know, there was an infrastructure for LGBT refugees. There was an infrastructure to, you know, how the city was able to organize it because there was a collective memory of this. So I think this is also very important to remember.
Not to rain on your parade, but that this infrastructure has been made available by quickly removing whoever has been using it up to date. So, you know, from me, from Polish point of view, the current influx of people from Ukraine is something completely new, of course. We've never seen people seeking shelter, seeking refuge in Poland in those numbers. It doesn't mean there weren't other nations forced to flee and seek safety in Poland. We had Chechens during the Chechen wars. Then we had Georgians during the short Russian-Georgian war. Then we had Ukrainians in 2014, and so on. So, well, of course, compared to the size of the country, those are all still small numbers. But again, not to rain on the parade, but what happened in Poland happened because of the civic society. It didn't happen because there was a plan. It didn't happen because there was an infrastructure. It happened because almost every ordinary Joe went to help. Okay? And unfortunately, the society went to help operating on emergency mode. That means putting their own lives on hold, opening their homes to those seeking refuge. And this emergency mode was supposed to last until the state gets its act together and starts planning and putting infrastructure and offering opportunities and options and solutions. Unfortunately, the state is very happy with the current state of affairs. I mean, they say everything went smoothly and then hey, we have no refugee camps. We have no refugee camps, but unfortunately, coming this autumn, we might have many homeless refugees because the emergency mode has to be turned off at some point.
So we have 4 people on the list. Anna, Agatha, yes, all of them, collecting all of them, and then okay, we start with Anna.
Thank you. Thank you for this this great panel. I have a couple of questions and just a short comment on the kind of historical and also geographical parallel with the former Yugoslavia. Actually, Serbia is the only country, as far as I know, that has a commissariat for refugees and for refugee management. And what I find quite interesting is that the head of this commissariat is a former communist who was in charge of a lot of the refugees policies and the kind of aid for internally displaced people in the 90s. So I think I can see that there is this kind of like continuation of practices and not necessarily everything is so bad. So I just wanted to add this slightly positive. I mean, the situation in Serbia is not good at all, but I find that at times this kind of intervention from the state side, running on precedents might be helpful. And I just have a couple of questions for Manuela. So the first one, you mentioned the connection between migration and the kind of the emergence of the nation state. And I wanted to slightly challenge you on that, in the sense that, you know, the Roman Empire was thinking about letting in migrant groups, perhaps to a certain, to a similar extent, right? Thinking about borders and how can we integrate these communities, etc. So I was wondering, what does it say of our own reasoning about migration if we think of it so as so entangled with the concept of the nation state? And if we challenge that, then how may we think of migration differently? And the second question that I had was, you mentioned this kind of exceptionality that comes with migration, that actually creates bad conditions for those who migrate. And I wonder if that is also connected with the apparent one directionality of many migration movements that kind of like move from, I don't know, south to north or east to west in different kind of contexts. So how much of the spatial element of this kind of impacts on this exceptionality that you mentioned? Thank you.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yes. I have a very general and difficult question. I'm even sorry to asking it, but let's use this popular format to maybe reestablish what we were saying on the margins of all of these questions. Like, what makes and what actually does it mean a good migration policy, and how can we achieve that? Like, what is needed, a kind of critical mass to implement it? So this is like a pact, at least at 3 levels, but I think we really need some hope, solidarity, and I think you can provide us with this, or at least kind of the box of I don't know, good practices of instruction, positive one. I thank you so much.
I have one question, a short comment on the historical perspective, because I'm working about Austrian refugees and the current situation. I would argue, and it's like in Germany, in Austria, it's also about the Massenzustromsrichtlinie, because it's a European Union regulation. But I have to admit that I don't think that it works very well in Austria, because there are a few of comments, and when you really talk to people who are working on every day with refugees, that they did not working very well in Austria. And in Austria, it's also a lot of NGOs doing the work, because there's not very good communication. There have to be more research about it, between the ministry and the ground working help. So I think that also, like in 2050, it does not work very well in Austria, so it could be better organized. And I have also to jump a little bit in the parade that everything is better. There are comments against refugees from Ukraine, especially from the far right party in Austria, who puts it together with the Austrian neutrality, that we have to be neutral in this conflict. And yeah, stupid comments like, why have the huge cars and can park for free in Austrian cities? Like, sorry, stupid things like that. But I think the reason why this is not very in the focus just is because from a historical perspective, we are jumping back to a migration and refugee perspective like in the Cold War. And I would say like in the beginning of the Cold War, where we have a huge enemy, and that's Russia. And we are stuck in this, okay, we have to help the people who are fighting against Russia. So it's very, and it's also, colleagues do this, it's very back to a Cold War mindset of whom we are helping. And my question goes in a totally another direction. I'm sorry. And just, I would be curious, because your panel is called Migration, of course, and we talk a lot about, as I did before, about refugees. And there is my question about a theoretical thing. What is your opinion about the distinction between migration and refugees? Is there a distinction, or can we just, or is there not? Because from my perspective, I had a lot of discussions with colleagues, historians, political science about, yeah, what's the focus on these terms? So.
One more, sorry. A completely non-normative technocratic observations and then a question. The observation is about osmotic vessels. One being, we are talking here about the unfreedom of movement. At the same time, we're living since 40 years in a world where there is increasing freedom of capital movement. And the observation is very simple. If labor can't move, then the places of labor will move. That is production. And I think this, might sound very simplistic, but I think it needs some consideration. A second non-normative observation is about, again, osmotic vessels. Poland having an anti-refugee policy. Now, of course, not recently, but previously. And at the same time having, I think per capita, the highest amount of non-refugee guest worker schemes. Closed for flight migrants, open for, of course, time-limited labor migration, even from Bangladesh, a Muslim country. And I guess it backs, it's a comment, but it backs explaining and how to deal with it. And the last comment is then a question, as it should be, which is, okay, since 40 years, we have a rise of migration studies and books, articles, networks, field. I also was in refugee studies for quite a while, or I'm still there. And anyway, at the same time, we have this paradox situation that we have rising anti-migrant and sometimes anti-refugee sentiments and politics. And so my provocative question is there a connection? And if so, are we maybe part of the problem in the way how we convey knowledge, not necessarily to experts or to politics, but to the larger being what we once upon called society? That's my question. Are we part of a problem, not knowing it?
So much, sorry, thank you so much for asking this last question. I was about to ask it, so thanks. Maybe I'll start because I presume my answers will be the briefest. I'm not good in all this, academic level debate. What is a good migration policy? Whoever ever gets it right deserves 10 times the Nobel Prize. Okay? The best we can do is keep trying, and we'll probably never get it entirely right, but well, some parts of it at least. We know what are the basics, both in good migration management and in integration policies, which is something slightly else. The question is, first of all, if we make the effort, or do we behave like the Polish government, that is a gentleman mentioned, issues the highest number of work permits to third country nationals in the whole EU, and at the same time has a zero refugee policy, with the expectations that, completely blind expectation, let me add, that those people will come here, earn their money and go back, just like as if they never heard about gastarbeiters, okay? So this is the government that is so convinced of their views being the only correct views and the only right views that they apparently don't want to learn from the history, from others' mistakes, maybe misguided attempts. For me, a good migration policy is, first of all, a policy that respects human dignity and human life. And that is surprisingly hard to come by in many cases. Another question was if there is a distinction between migrant and refugee or asylum seeker. That's actually something I talked about with Daniel, who is also part of the research team. We have this, we have this very clear legal distinction, right? If you come here for work, then you're an economic migrant. If you come here because of persecution or armed conflict, then you're an asylum seeker. The thing is, life isn't all that black and white. It's not always 0-1 choice. And to give you an example, we had 2 years ago, I think, we had a group of students from Turkey who legally were economic migrants, right? They came here to study. Here to Poland, yeah. And when Erdogan started the hunt for Gülenists, those students discovered that their passports weren't valid anymore, that they were kind of, removed from citizens' registers, not welcome, not wanted back. And the only thing they could do was to seek asylum in Poland, because what else? The inseparable part of being a refugee is that this is something that happens without your own volition. It's not a choice you make, it's a choice that circumstances made for you. And that's the worst part of being a refugee altogether. You don't really have control. First of all, it's a war or persecution or political situation, something that forces you to abandon your home country. And from there on, until you eventually possibly get your refugee status or subsidiary protection, something, or other legal status anyway, every your move is decided by someone else. First is the smuggler that tells you which way to go. And then it's the migration authorities that tell you where you can stay, what you can do, what you cannot do, what is expected, and so on. And if you're in a detention center while waiting for your asylum decision, that's even worse, because detention centers are practically prisons, and we all know what extensions of freedom, civil freedom, personal freedoms you have in prison. In one of those detention centers in Poland, people don't have names, they have numbers, just to give you an example. So yes, until you get your positive decision on your asylum claim, it's out of your hands. And I'll stop here because I know my colleagues also have a lot to say. So I'm passing on